Recently, I watched a talk by Nabil Hussain titled Computing, Climate Change, and All of Our Relationships. In it, Nabil posed a question that I find myself really enamored with. How are all of your relationships? I imagine that if I stopped a stranger on the street or approached one of my close friends and asked them this question, it might take them a long time to come up with an answer that they were satisfied with. At the very least, I would hope so, because even after watching this talk a few times and mulling over the question in my own head, I struggled to form an answer that I thought truly tackled the question. And Nabil addresses the complexity of this question himself.
I thought about my relationships with the other people in that room. I was working remotely, and it was a valuable chance to build these connections with the people who I so often saw behind the screen. I thought of the work that I had been putting into my relationships with my friends and family, and my joy, in the improvements that I had seen there. I also thought of the wrong that I had done and the obligations that I had to try to repair that. And I thought not only of my relationships with people who I know, I thought also of my relationships with people who I've never met.
It's that last part that really stuck with me. The relationships with people who I have never met. Because at first it sounds kind of insane, right? How do you have a relationship with someone you've never even met? To illustrate this idea, Nabil gives a really quick example of a smartphone, and it's a topic that I want to go into a little bit more depth on because I think it's an example that is pertinent for a lot of the people that might see this video. So, for a second, just take a look at your phone and ask where it comes from. The easy answer might be something like the Apple Store, the AT&T Store, or Amazon or some other online retailer. But then, where did they get the phone from? It's not like they took all the parts and constructed it in the store just for you, and even if they did, where did all of those parts come from? Your touchscreen contains indium, which might come from a factory somewhere in Korea. Your battery, which contains components like lithium and cobalt, probably sources materials from Australia and the DRC respectively. The nickel that makes up a large part of your phone's inner electronics and casing might come from Indonesia. And all of these materials, among others, are consolidated and constructed in some factory in China before being shipped out to whatever store you bought it from. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people have had a hand in making a device that you use to listen to music or call your friends. There's a bit of tragic irony in the fact that the device most deeply integrated with the maintenance of modern relationships stems from hundreds of other relationships that most people will never even know about. What's more, if we take the time to look at most of these relationships, we might begin to see how toxic they are. Just looking at the cobalt in your phone's battery. The mines that produce the cobalt for your battery run off of notoriously poor working conditions. To be blunt, these rechargeable batteries are powered by modern day slavery. Siddharth Kara, an individual researching this modern day slavery, states that no clean supply chain of cobalt exists, which is true. And like it or not, you have a relationship with the people in these cobalt mines. So, this brings us back to the original question. How are all of your relationships? In a book by Tung Hui Hu titled A Prehistory of the Cloud, he talks about the concept of layered technologies and how new and old medias are layered on top of each other, just as the railroad track is layered with fiber optic conduit. This is a concept that has stuck with me for a while and one that I feel applies to these relationships too. These relationships are built on practices and ideologies that thrive from systems of oppression, and ultimately it is impossible to simply remove corruption from these relationships without rebuilding their foundations. So, we have an answer to our question. How are all of your relationships? Bad. A lot of my relationships are bad. Which brings us to what I think is a question that follows quite naturally. What do I do about it? Nabil provides an answer of his own.
It must be done for you. We must repair all of our relationships, not for anyone else's sake, but for our own. Thank you.
We must repair all of our relationships. This is a statement that I would agree with, that I think most people would agree with. We should do the work to repair all of these relationships. But this is also a statement that feels a little bit like a punch in the gut. Because the obstacle isn't knowing what to do about these issues, it's how to deal with them. There's a journal article called Imperial Debris that I feel very similarly about. The article focuses on modern day imperial foundations, and while I don't have the time to explain it here, I think it's worth a read. But the author ends the article with a statement about how we should renew colonial studies, rethink the way we look at history. And I remember thinking, great, now what? Because the answer is always easier to come up with than the steps to get there, right? What will I do to repair these relationships? How do we repair these relationships? And after a lot of thought, the answer I have come to is we can't. I remember a few years ago in high school having a conversation with my friends about the voting process, and I distinctly remember one of them saying that they wouldn't vote because they didn't feel like they could make a difference. And I remember thinking how stupid that was. Being able to vote is one of the main advantages of living in a democratic society, and they were throwing it away because they didn't feel like it mattered? And as stupid as I thought they were at that moment, right now, I feel myself empathizing with them. And I work on these relationships in any way that matters. I can stop buying a new phone whenever my old one stops working, and I can decide to bike more often, and I can shop locally, and I can boycott hundreds of companies, but does it matter? No matter what I do, these relationships still exist. Why should I make a sacrifice for what oftentimes feels like nothing? I will be the first to admit this is a very, very selfish perspective, even if it is rational. So, my answer to the question, what will you do to repair your relationships, is that the question is wrong. The question should not be what will you do, but instead what can you do. I will never individually be able to make a tangible difference on a global scale. That isn't a reasonable goal, and it isn't something that I should necessarily feel motivated to achieve, because it's a goal that I will fail to reach. Instead, I think it's better to think about what I can do. I can donate to groups that are making a difference somewhere else in the world. I can be more vocal about these issues that make me upset or uncomfortable. To the world, these actions might not matter, but on an individual level they do. So, to echo Nabil's own response, do the work for yourself. You are the only common denominator in all of your own relationships, so the least you can do is take responsibility for yourself. Not for the world, not for your family or your friends, but for yourself.